So thank you. Thank you everyone for coming back to our panel 3, Nersēs musician. It's an honor to have Professor Haig Utidjian joining us from Prague. And actually, it's an first time experience for me to hear musical performance on Zoom. So I'm very much looking forward to it. Haig is a professional orchestral and opera conductor with wide experience and currently serves as the chief conductor of the orchestra and chorus of Charles University in Prague. He is also a researcher at the Centro de Estudios de Sociología, and I'm not going to pronounce the rest of it, musical at the University of Lisboa, and a senior deacon of the Armenian Orthodox Church with research interests in the music, iconography, and the theology of the Armenian hymnal, and on the works of Saint Gregory Narek. He is a team member of research project entitled The Echoes from the Past, Unveiling a Lost Soundscape with Digital Analysis. And he is a contributor to the project entitled Thinking Music, Global Sources for the History of the Music Theory. Without further ado, there's a lot more I would very much like to say about Haig, but he is no stranger to many of us here. So without further ado, I would like to pass the platform to you, Haig, and we're looking forward to both the presentation and also to your performance. Thank you.
Thank you very much, dear Annie. Very good evening to you, ladies and gentlemen. This isn't a concert, so you've been very kindly referring to a performance, but it's just that to make the presentation meaningful and perceptible and comprehensible, particularly to those of us who may not be particularly adept at the Limōnčean notation or indeed Western staff notation, I feel that I really ought to sing bits and pieces so that the points that I shall try to make can come alive, as it were. And you must forgive me because yesterday I had a large-scale choral rehearsal with 3 combined choirs, and then a choral orchestra rehearsal of the Verdi Requiem, during which time I used my voice a lot, and very little of it is now left. So any demonstrations will be done sotto voce, very, very cautiously, so that I can manage to complete this lecture, including the musical demonstrations. So, on the odes of Saint Nersēs the Gracious, sources and transmission on the one hand, neumations and melodies on the other hand. Before I start, from the bottom of my heart, I should like to dedicate this talk to the memory of Maestro Joren Mecanegian, of whose passing I was informed only a few days ago, a personage that I associate very strongly with my very positive recollections from the St. Nersess Seminary and from the St. Vartan Cathedral, from the time when I was fortunate enough to spend a couple of weeks at the St. Nersess Seminary about 12 years ago, when my hosts were Professor Abraham Deryan and Father Michael Fendekian and Archbishop Yeriche Gizirian of blessed memory. And on that occasion, there was also a very, very fine young priest by the surname of Malchasian, a distant relative of the very distinguished lexicographer and philologist. So given that the pleasant burden of giving a musical lecture as part of this splendid conference has fallen on my shoulders, I decided that I should like to make this dedication, if I may. Now, the motivation for my choice of subject is quite a hybrid thing because it has several elements. First of all, during the celebrations or the commemorations of the passing of the saint in 2023, I was called upon to give a lecture at a conference devoted to the memory of the saint at the Madenataran Institute, for which I decided to immerse myself on some musicological problems associated with the saint's legacy. And there were subsequent lectures also in different places, including the Holy See of Etchmiadzin and various others, of which the most recent was 2 weeks ago at the San Lazzaro Academy in Venice. Another thing that motivated me to look at those things was the very kind invitation I received to devise and organize and conduct a program consisting of music associated with the words of St. Nersēs the Gracious that was due to happen at the Sistine Chapel. Sadly, for reasons that are not entirely clear to me, this event was cancelled or indefinitely postponed, but much of the benefit of the work that I did towards it remains, and there will be a substantial volume consisting of transcriptions, redactions, commentary, article introduction, and translations associated with that event, which has also informed my lecture this evening. And Peter Cowie approached me about a year ago asking me about those odes of St. Nersēs the Gracious for which melodies are now in existence, and that in turn motivated me to investigate that as well. And an article is about to appear on this in Pasmaweb, the journal of the San Lazzaro Academy. So all three of these things motivated me to prepare some of this work. And so what is going to be my procedure? Well, I will start at the beginning, as it were, and end at a relatively recent fixed point on the time axis. And my starting point will be the year 1241, the date on which the earliest known neumated source to include odes by the saint is dated. So we start at 1241, and that manuscript, in fact, has a colophon which gives us some tantalising hints about the manner in which the scribe, a chap called Hovhannes, committed the odes to his codex, words and neumes, musical signs. And my final fixed point on this time axis is the turn of the 19th and 20th centuries, and in particular two Armaš manuscripts that were copied at another distinguished seminary, not very far from Constantinople, a seminary that in a short period of time managed to produce a very fine crop of clergy who spread light and culture for decades subsequently. And these manuscripts, these turn-of-the-century manuscripts, were now notated in the Limōnčean notation, the new Armenian notational system that was devised by the year 1812 as a sort of parallel thing to similar developments in Constantinople with the Byzantine tradition, with the difference that the Chrysantine notation, as the new Byzantine notation is known, is still closely connected to the Middle Byzantine notation, whereas the Armenian new notation effected a very substantial and radical departure from the medieval pneumatic notation. So in that sense, the Armenian system, the new Armenian system, is analogous not to the Chrysantine notation, but to another Greek system, the so-called lesbian notation after Georgios Lesbios. So my latest source, my newest, my most modern source consists of 2 volumes copied in Armaš at the turn of the century. And so I shall proceed by considering all the melodies that are available to me, and I will collate musical variants of the same ode notated in places such as Venice, Constantinople, Jerusalem, as well as Armaš. And I will try to gain some insight about the manner in which oral and written paths of transmission were intertwined, which indeed they were, in interesting and perhaps unexpected ways. And I will also do one other thing. I will put the medieval neumes together with the extant melodies to see if we can reach any conclusions from such a comparison, particularly concerning the degree of antiquity of the melodies. So let's look at the earliest source. It's a manuscript kept at the Bibliothèque Nationale de France. It was acquired from Constantinople in 1730, and it consists of a book of litanies, a book of odes, and the chants of the divine liturgy, and it constitutes the earliest source we have for the latter two genres. Since the 19th century, eminent scholars such as Macler and even Father Revont Alishan had assumed that the entire codex dated from 1241, but Armine Köşkeryan in 1971, remarkably, working as she was from a microfiche copy alone, demonstrated convincingly that the first and most extensive part of the codex, a book of litanies, was added as a later replacement, added no later than in 1361. But the bit that concerns us, the part that is the Book of Odes, does date from 1241. It includes a collection of some 100 or so items, although the number sharply increases if items that are labeled as poch, as antiphons, were to be counted as separate entities. Famously, this manuscript includes 13 of the 21 odes by St. Gregory of Narek, including the example you can see on the left, Havun Artenatial, the fowl, and some 70 or so odes by St. Nersēs the Gracious, the single author by far most prolifically represented in the collection. And in case you may be wondering, interestingly enough, the third part, which is in a different hand, is a very brief section devoted to the chants of the divine liturgy, which also includes items believed to have been composed and introduced into the liturgy by St. Nersess the Gracious, and again constitutes our earliest neumated source for those chants. And this is immediately followed by a colophon that starts in mid-folio, directly following the chants of the divine liturgy, and in the same handwriting as the odes of the second part of the manuscript. So it seems that the chants of the liturgy were copied by a different scribe from a different source, but with the knowledge of the principal scribe, that of the odes, who is Hovhannes. And it is this colophon that gives us some interesting hints about the way in which a scribe may have been working. I'll just give you a summary of it. Our scribe is a chap, a musician by the name of Hovhannes, who seems to have studied in the Armenian kingdom of Cilicia, and then returned to Armenia proper, but was disappointed by the environment he found in the land of his nurture. He found it to be, in his own words, a very dishonorable and vile place where people had descended into laxness and fallen behind in the love of God and pursued transitory things. So he decided he wanted to return to Cilicia, which he considered a land of lovers of learning and of philosophy. But the poor chap was robbed on his way back, and he lost all his manuscripts. Obliged as he was to start afresh, he did what he could on his own, but felt the need to consult a more expert source, at length finding a very beautiful manuscript in the possession of an expert musician called Husep, the like of whom, he says, no longer existed even at the time of his writing the colophon. And Hovhannes worked at the royal monastery of Terazarg, which is a place famous for its mausoleum for Armenian kings and Catholicoi. And all the items are notated with neumes. Now, ambiguities abound in the colophon. The orthography and the syntax of the scribe leave something to be desired. And he says that he painstakingly appended the difficult melodies of the hymns he included, but it's not clear what he appended them to, or exactly what he appended to what. Conceivably neumes to words, or successive sections of the codex devoted to various genres to each other. And then there's this wonderful sentence, First I wrote through learning, and only then from what was written. This too is rather equivocal. It has diverse implications on the interplay between memory, oral transmission, and the use of notation underpinning the preparation of Codex P79, as this manuscript is known as. Had he memorized the melodies and then provisionally transcribed those as best he could into the neumatic system, possibly with or without the words, later completing the work by dint of collating and obtaining versions from the choice codex he was able to borrow from Husep. If this is the case, then interestingly, he did not merely slavishly copy from another codex, but he made direct use of his own memory in combination with one or more written sources. But of course, the opposite is also possible. He might have written out the words and added the neumes embodying the melodies later. And so, appending, when he says that he painstakingly appended difficult melodies for these hymns, could refer to a hybrid modus operandi, a complex process of collating and bringing together the above elements in any appropriate order. And of course, it behoves us to inspect the manuscript itself. You can see again, this is a page that I've got in color, so I like to show it off. We find that initial majuscules and neumes are in red, whilst the verbal text is in black. But it doesn't seem likely that folio after folio Hovhannes would have written the text first, with gaps left for the neumes to be added much later. There are places where the neumes may seem a little bit cramped, but there are also instances where in later stanzas the scribe was reluctant to copy out the same melisma in full, perhaps relying on the fact that whoever used the manuscript would have memorized the melismata and sung them without requiring the full notation. Gaps do appear from time to time. And of course, we don't know what intermediate materials the scribe had. He may have had various provisional rough copies which did not survive. All of this serves to expose how little we know of the procedures of Armenian scribes and cantors in the Middle Ages. Now, let us turn to the odes. I mentioned San Lazzaro, and San Lazzaro has versions for 3 of the odes by St. Nersess, melodies for 3 of the odes, Nordzarig, Zaravetsav Dernichachin, and Parpar Avediats. But we do have other versions also. Let's start with the first of these, Nordzarig. Now, Nordzarig has a popular and very well-loved melody, and until recently, I believed something that I read written by the Soviet-era musicologist Nigoros Tahmisian, who claimed that this melody cannot possibly be associated with the ode by the saint, as the words deviate from the proper words of the ode. I checked, and I wasn't convinced of that, other than the fact that we find the refrain Avedis, Avedis, good news, interspersed amongst the words of the ode, although, to be fair, there is the possibility that Tahmisian may have had access to an older source with rather different words. It is possible that the sources that have the melodies that are available to me may already have modified the words to suit those by the saint, those found in Pank Chapav. Just to give you a little idea of the melody, I will sing a little of this celebrated melody, which I'm sure many of you will recognize. Nordzarig Zaratzov Aisor in orke melodies. This is a melody that is well loved in Armenian circles, and one hears it rather often. It is rather beautiful, I find, in its simplicity, and it can be sung with the words of the saints, so it is, in my opinion, a valid melody. But it's not the only one we've got. And during one of my visits to Constantinople, the late deacon Nersēs Utidjian very kindly gave me a copy of a version of this ode, copied in his own hand, I believe, and that's labeled as Meretiv Vartavari. Now, this melody, this ode, is usually sung for feasts of the Holy Resurrection, and thus it may be deployed on any ordinary Sunday, because ordinary Sundays are devoted to the Holy Resurrection. But in this manuscript by Deacon, in Deacon Nersēs's hand, it's referred to as Meretiv Vartavari, to be sung during the Divine Liturgy, during the Feast of the Holy Transliteration, and accordingly the ending is truncated to make it fit smoothly with the processional cantimus hymn associated with nocturnes of that day, consistent with the custom of deploying a melismatic version of the cantimus sung at nocturnes as a processional hymn during the Divine Liturgy, following the ode sung during the preparation of the gifts. And the melody is described as belonging to the Hijaz Uzal Makam, which an Armenian explanatory note indicates that it is Kimtsai and Daniken, from the family of the third authentic mode. In other words, it is a type of Hijaz, but a specific type, and the Makam Uzal is associated with a tendency, whether in the upper tetrachord, the higher notes of the melody, as we move upwards in the Limōnčean notation, we encounter a vernachar sign, which represents more or less an F sharp, whilst when the melody goes downwards, we find a chunj with a tilde, with a gisver, in other words, an F natural. I'll sing you a little bit of this to give you an idea of what it's like. It's completely different from the other melody that I sung to you. Nor sorry, it's and so on. This will give you an idea. There was a little error in the manuscript as well, which misled me. Forgive me for that. But I think this suffices to give you an idea of how very different this version is to the other one, the much better known one. But this is not all. It turns out that there is a version in San Lazzaro in Venice, of which a manuscript transcription was very kindly shown to me by Father Serafino, by Father Serofpe, with what I considered to be self-evidently a very different melody. At least that's what I thought at the time. It looked to me to be very much a sort of tagen asteri, a small category of rather melismatic hymns in a particular mode. And I was very kindly called upon to sing this at the end of the Shnorali conference at the Madenataran Institute. And I sang it at the time under the impression that it is indeed tagen asteri. So the opening of it I sang rather like this. And as you heard, I sang F sharps, not only here, nor, where one is written, but I added F sharps there and there as well, assuming that they were absent as a result of an omission, as a result of an error. So I sang nor, do. After all, I justified myself not only by my assumed context, musical context of tagen asteri, but also I saw that Father Leonce Dayan had written a natural sign here, indicating that that F has to be a natural, not a sharp, but there wasn't any other sharp other than this one here, if you can see my arrow. So I assumed it was a kind of courtesy accidental, that given that the last sung F would have been sung sharp, or so I thought, namely here, then a reminder was necessary that, look, it's not sharp anymore, sing a natural. It did not occur to me that Father Leonce might have meant for those two notes to be sung natural without a sharp, which would have created a very odd effect, as I thought. Nor, da, ari, di, 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 di. That sounded odd to my ears, so I rather blithely and confidently assumed that this was tagen asteri, and I had an F sharp there and an F sharp there. And for the transcription and redaction that I included for the Pasmaweb article, I was, of course, prudent enough to put the sharps in square brackets, indicating that it was an editorial edition. But I didn't think much more of it until my good friend, the eminent musicologist Haig Utidjian, who has been doing a lot of extremely valuable work over the years in Cairo, in Egypt, very kindly made available to me a new publication of his consisting of transcriptions made by Father Shakarian in Jerusalem when he was still a deacon. I think he was Deacon Vartavar. Before the genocide, he started the manuscript in 1914. This was before the main influx of Constantinopolitan musicians who, so to speak, flooded Jerusalem. And one unintended consequence of this was that, to my mind, very little of what used to be sung in Jerusalem survived, because these Constantinopolitan chaps were so very dominant, and they knew musical notation. And the Jerusalem melodies, to the best of my knowledge, had not been notated. But it's possible that this Shakarian chap may have captured some of what was sung in Jerusalem as well. It's not entirely clear how much he copied and how much he transcribed on the basis of what was sung around him. And so Haig Utidjian sent me his new publication, and lo and behold, there was a version of Nordzarig, which you can see in the middle here. This is the beginning. And lo and behold, the shapes of the melodies look very similar to those of the Constantinopolitan Kimtza, Hijaz melody. The contours are very similar, but whereas the modality of this is Kimtza, here you will find something that is very, very reminiscent and suggestive of the dilemma I faced when I was editing the Venetian melody, which you can see on the left-hand side. So it's and so there's a C sharp there, that's the little sign, the tilde that sharpens this C natural, and there, but everything else afterwards, all the C's are natural. And this is very similar to what we get if we take Father Leon's Dayan at face value and don't insert any sharps where he doesn't have any. So it seems to me rather intriguingly that here are the analogous bits, as long as we exclude those editorial sharps, which I added cautiously and perhaps ought not to have done at all. So the Jerusalem version may have served as a kind of bridge between the Venetian version, which to my mind seemed to be largely to be Tagen Asteri, and the Hijaz Uzal version in Constantinople. The modality of the Jerusalem version is a little uncertain, but it seems to behave a bit like the Makam Shehnaz for the opening, and then eventually it ends as Husseini, which is our traditional Penza Makam. So the modalities differ, and the middle version may be a kind of bridge between the other two, but the shapes are rather similar. And this, of course, raises suspicions. How may those melodies be related to each other? What does all this mean? How are they connected? And did the chicken come first or the egg? I'll talk about this a little later, but let us try and equip ourselves a little better by examining 2 or 3 other odes as well and see what we find. But shortly afterwards, there was another delightful event, namely, during one of my conversations with Father Serofpe in San Lazzaro, I was moaning that I knew there were these Armaš manuscripts in the Caucasus to which I was not allowed access, in fact, had been refused access point blank, and I needed them for my article for Pasmaweb, and could he not intercede on my behalf. And Father Serafino spoke to a very nice gentleman at the Madenatran called Vahe Torosian, and lo and behold, I received a very kind email from Dr. Torosian a couple of days later, and then received photographs of the Armaš manuscripts a couple of days after that. And of course, I was able to find a lot of interesting things in those manuscripts, including this very ode, Nordzarig, in a version that is very, very similar to Neshan Hoja's Constantinopolitan version, except the Armaš manuscript is longer and it covers more of the words, whereas, as I said, the Neshan Hoja one was truncated. At this point, I ought also to express my gratitude to another worker at the Madenataran, Mrs. Astrid Musherian, who was kind enough to inform me of some of the contents of the Armaš manuscripts, a couple of which she has transcribed in her very useful volume about the musical traditions associated with Armaš. So I'm very grateful to her as well. Now, let us leave Nordzarig for the time being and look at another ode for which it seemed no one outside San Lazzaro knew that there might be melodies available. And so this is the Armaš version of Nordzarig. So I now move on. And that's Zaravetsav Derni Khachin. And Gurerian's Garkavorutun volume, which is a marvelous compendium in a single volume. You've got a combined lectionary, hymnal, breviary, typicon. So with that volume in your hand, you don't need anything else. Everything is in the right sequence. It follows the church calendar. And by the way, Gurerian has the finest neumations that ever appeared on the printed page. They have not been reached, let alone be surpassed. And anyway, in Garkavorutun, he says, towards the end of the liturgy on Good Friday, the order of the crucifixion, this is a service that is not held in many places, sadly, but it is in San Lazzaro, where it is done fully and properly. And he says, Yevasendar urpatu. And they say, or he means they sing the Friday ode, Zaravetsav deren. The Lord was thirsty on the cross. Gam aildar Cilicia gam isharaganats chachi. Or some other ode of the crucifixion, or one of the hymns of the Holy Cross. So Zaravetsav is actually named in the Garkavorutun, suggesting that this is a tradition of very long standing. But I haven't found it mentioned anywhere else. So you can see a photograph that I took, that's why I'm not in it, on Good Friday, and you can see Father Serofpe singing the ode. And I transcribed it from a manuscript he kindly made available to me, but I proceeded to make some small modifications on the basis of what was sung on Good Friday in San Lazzaro 3 weeks ago. So this is the transcription I made from the manuscript, and I discussed it with Father Serofpe. But here you can see where I've put the arrow. I've added in square brackets something that he sung differently from the written page, and I rather liked it and felt it ought to be captured. I'll just sing you the beginning of this, if I may, because time is advancing inexorably. And so on. I purposely sung this much because I want to ask some questions as to who might have composed the music for this ode. The ode, to my ear, sounds pensa, and the thing is, it contains motifs that are uncannily reminiscent of other San Lazzaro chants, two particular chants. One for Trmpatsek, the opening of the doors ceremony carried out at Vespers on Palm Sunday. There is a dialogue between those outside who wish to go in. The high-ranking clergy sings, Pats mes deres turnvormutian, open, Lord, unto us the door of mercy. And then, usually what happens, a deacon or another clergyman from behind the doors responds by saying, who do you think you are? Why on earth should I open the door for you? These doors are open only for the righteous, paraphrasing the psalm. And in San Lazzaro, this dialogue that is usually recited in most churches is sung, both the outside and the inside. And it's sung in a pensa melody that exhibits a motif that you find in Zaravetsav as well. And the whole passage is neumated in sources. So it does really suggest that in the old days, perhaps everyone would sing this, but we've lost the melodies and we recite them, but they've kept something in San Lazzaro. And the plot thickens when we look at the Cantimus hymn for Good Friday, the Utidjian version. The hymn in question is Arzatsirutiamp Molial Huta. Judas led astray by his avarice, a very, very moving hymn, also pensa. And San Lazzaro has kept a very, very beautiful, lengthy, slow, highly melismatic melody, which is attributed to none other than Baba Hampartsum Limōnčean, the co-inventor of the new Armenian notational system. Ironically, I haven't found any version of that melody in the Limōnčean notation that bears his name, but the melody was kept alive orally in San Lazzaro until it was transcribed rather more recently. So I'll show you the two motifs in question in Zaravetsav are those two that I've labeled here. Oh, first of all, the yellow arrow and the little miniature photograph of Father Serofpe accounts for that B natural there that you can see in square brackets. So that's my justification. And the red brace embodies the melody Well, in Trmpatsek, this is sung And if we look at the Arzatsirutiamp, which I notated myself in the Limōnčean notation on the basis of an archival 1974 recording where the late Father Vertanes Uluhodjian is singing So you see it is the same motif. As for the second motif, we find it here in Arzatsirutiamp. Which is the same thing. Now, does this mean that our ode, Zaravetsav der Nichachin, was composed by Baba Hampartsum Limōnčean as well? Possibly, but we can't be sure because the similarity is not proof of common authorship. Someone may have been inspired to compose one or other of those things on the basis of something earlier, a common root to all, or these motifs may have been just floating in the air, saturating the minds and hearts of church musicians, whether in Constantinople or San Lazzaro, I know not. But it is a very interesting connection. And of course, in my newly acquired spoils, namely the Armaš manuscripts, I found a completely different version as well of Zaravetsav der Nichachin that is completely different. And it is in the Ajem Asheran Makam, which perhaps some of you may not have heard of, but in fact it is not exactly uncommon in Armenian sacred music, as I'll show you in a moment. But I'll show you a little bit of the opening so that you can see what the melody sounds like roughly. And so on. So it's a major key, as you see. Now, other examples of Ajem Asheran, one of them is the Alleluk that we sing at the end of nocturnes at Christmas. I'll sing you a little bit. Alleluia, alleluia, alleluia. It's exactly the same makam. And there's yet another example from the Divine Liturgy. If you look at the Ekmalian transcription, the hymn of praise after communion, Kohanam Keskender, it's the same modal world inhabited by this. And there's one other example as well, very, very intriguing, because it's mentioned in Father Minas Pezeshkian's manuscript monograph of 1812 as an example of Ajem Asheran, and it's none other than Havun Artnatsial by St. Gregory of Narek, but not the well-known melody. In fact, neither of the relatively well-known melodies, but something else that I found in San Lazzaro. And had it not been for this transcription, which we owe Father Revon Dayan, who made it in 1934, we would know of the existence of the melody, but never get to see or hear the melody. Havun, and it really behaves as described by Father Minas Pezeshkian. So the Armaš Zaravetsav belongs to this very sound world, very different from the environment of kneeling in front of the cross and lamenting about the crucifixion and that our Lord was athirst whilst on the cross. I turn to my third example now, if I may. And here we find two rather different versions, both from San Lazzaro. The first one published in 1877, if my memory serves, but probably transcribed earlier, by the brilliant Venetian musician and great lover of Armenian sacred music, Pietro Bianchini, one of my heroes. It's Parpar Avediats for the Annunciation, and I'll sing you a little bit of it. Avedia, quotes. Now contrast this, however, by the later transcription by Father Leonce Dayan. Por, por, so you see, it's completely different modally. It's a minor mode, a kind of harmonic minor mode. One might say something like Kimca, or maybe Pensatarcevatsk, or Hijaz, if you will. Whereas the one on the left, even the tonality is the same. They start on a C, they move very similarly, but we have por, por. This leads me to suspect there are other examples of similar things happening. Could it be that Bianchini heard something that was sung in a very delicate way, something that he was not quite able to capture using the equally tempered Western staff notation that was available to him at the time? Someone may have sung the E that you see here very, very slightly flattened, and likewise, the B natural you can see there may have been very, very slightly flattened. There is evidence in examples we find of other things in the Limōnčean notation, the earliest transcriptions, that suggests that these things were sung much more delicately. So he heard something that was neither major nor minor, and he tried to approximate it as best he could. Whereas by the time Dayan wrote it, either Dayan decided to reduce it to something that was Kimca, or more probably, I say more probably because Dayan himself divided a system whereby he could indicate quarter tones, and you find them in many of his manuscripts, but not here. Or by the time of Dayan, the rather more subtle and sophisticated modality had been reduced to something more common, something easier to sing, and so that is what Dayan notated. So we have now several intriguing cases of melodies being modified, transformed, changing a little, not very much, perhaps the shapes remaining the same, but the modality and the intervals being modified, even on the same island, let alone between different geographical centers. I'll return to this at the end of my talk, but I want briefly to look at the neumes. Now, I promised I'd show you some of the neumations of these odes. I'll show you Norzarik, Zaravetsav, and Parparavediats, and I'll do so quickly so that we don't delay too much. Now, we don't understand the medieval Armenian neumes, but we are able to elicit all sorts of bits of indirect information from them using a bit of detective work. For example, the density of the notation itself can be informative. How the notation changed over time may be of interest. We find often chains of interconnected neumes that appear as blocks, they recur. That means we can draw up a sort of plan, something about the form, about the way in which an ode may have been sung, and the distribution of neumes over the text can also be quite eloquent. And this brings me to a particular way in which we can use the neumes for our present purpose, which we owe the greatest Armenian musicologist of all time, Haig Utidjian. He carried out empirical work as well as some astute observation. I won't go into it because I've talked about it extensively on other occasions. But he decided that he could associate metrical values with syllables bearing particular neumes or none, and he tabulated 4 categories, and we can examine our neumated sources on this basis, and we won't know what the melodies sounded like that were sung, but we can tell, according to those principles, how long a singer was expected to spend on particular syllables of text, and see whether that has been preserved in the melodies at our disposal. Spoiler alert, we don't have very much time left. The short answer is no. The melodies that we have do not correspond to the durational lengths associated with the neumes. This is Nortzarig from the manuscript about which I expatiated earlier in this talk, the Paris number 79 d'Agaran, copied and notated by scribe Johannes. And I used other sources as well, two Madenataran manuscripts. And although here I've encircled in red, the verbal text is a little different, and nonetheless, the same number of syllables and the same number of beats has been preserved. So we've got long, short, long, short, long, short. It's all very crude, but even this is sufficient to demonstrate that none of the melodies we've got for Nortzarig could possibly correspond to those neumes. Now, you can be a fanatic, and as certain people are, and have it as an article of faith that the melodies we now have and know date from the 12th century, and these are the ones that the saint sang. Well, good luck to you, because then you've got to explain why they don't correspond to the neumations that were that have reached us from manuscript sources that were copied out within decades of the passing of the saint. Let's look at Dzaravetsav. Here again, we see Dzaravetsav, dern, ichachin, vor besesmart. Ein, vor arar, zov gianos, zov keretzig. Long, short, short, long, long, short, short, long, long, short, short, long, and so forth. Again, none of these sources, and I'm sure I would find others to be similar, because usually one finds that most of the manuscripts have more or less the same neumes, and where the duration, where a particular neume is different in a source, usually it is another neume that has the same metrical duration associated with it, so the meter is not affected. Finally, Parpara Vedyats that I showed you. This is again the Paris manuscript that I'd talked about. Now, here we have slight differences in the durations. So, for example, this Venice manuscript has short, long, short, short, long, short, long, and so on. All this is very crude, but again, it is sufficient to show that the melodies that we've got cannot possibly correspond to those neumes, and therefore do not really have very much to do with what the saint may have sung. As I'm now approaching the end of my presentation, for the sake of completeness, I want to say that very happily we have yet another melody for another ode, Nastial Ganaiken, also to be found in the Armaš manuscript. So I'm delighted about that, but I should now like to proceed to some of my conclusions, if I may. So my conclusion is basically a question, and then a very feeble attempt to provide little bits and pieces that could conceivably be partial answers, but with great caution. So what can the interrelationships between those melodies tell us about the modes of transmission? At least in the San Lazzaro context, we find that earlier transcriptions are apt to be modally more unusual from a modern perspective, from our own perspective perhaps, and even possibly from Dayan's time. And there has been a tendency for simplification and modal standardization. We find other cases of this as well. So, for example, there is a glorious Alleluc sung in San Lazzaro at Tenebre on Maundy Thursday in the night during the Saturday nocturnes in effect, where Diane's notation has a very complex and splendid mode that is not very easy to pull off, but it is marvelous. And yet there's a recording of the late Father Vertanes Utidjian, who has sung it in a simpler, less exotic mode. That's another example of the same thing happening. By the way, this Alleluk, Zartiav Averan, this versicle is not a psalm. It comes from Ampagum, from the prayer of Habakkuk, which succeeds Psalm 147 in the Armenian canon. In a loose sense, the Armenian tradition treats the entirety of the 8 canons of the Psalter as psalms, even things that are not psalms. We find the same phenomenon in the case of the ode Ndrialet Hastudzov Yerchanig Sup Hairabed, that is sung when the celebrant is a patriarch or high-ranking clergyman. If we compare the Bianchini 1862 transcription, again, there's a very Eastern-sounding, lovely modality to it, whereas those transcriptions made by Diana almost a century later lack that modality. And we find it in the Serpasatsutiunk, the hagiologies, or hagiades, if you like, as we proceed from Bianchini to Diane. We find that there's simplification modally, as well as in terms of ornamentation and degree of melismaticity. So it is reasonable to suppose that the modally unconventional or unusual variants may well have been precursors to subsequent versions that do bear signs of simplification, standardization. There's also evidence for the role of oral transmission. Some of the melodic contours have stayed the same. They may have lingered in the mind of singers and church musicians, even in a new or different modal context, or even in the same mode, as in the case of the Venetian Zaravetsav der Nichachin, where I demonstrated that there were 2 motifs that you find in other chants as well. Finally, we cannot tell the age of the melodies with any certainty. Some may be associated with the 2 Baba Hampartsums, Baba Hampartsum Limōnčean, the inventor or co-inventor of the notational system that bears his name, or the later Hampartsum, Baba Hampartsum Cherchian, who is associated with the Armaš tradition and the Armaš manuscripts, from which I showed you some examples. Other melodies may be somewhat older, but in any event, the complete disparity with the neumations strongly suggests that nothing we have by way of melodies of the odes of Saint Nersēs the Gracious is of any appreciable antiquity. Ladies and gentlemen, this does not reduce either their artistic value or their sanctity one whit. Perhaps transmission in the early modern period, which we have looked at, manifests a certain balance between change and stability, adherence to manuscript witness, memory and orality, that is, come to think of it, not all that different from the procedures of our scribe of manuscript P79 in 1241 AD. At the same time, all this serves to expose how very little we know of the procedures of Armenian scribes and cantors in the Middle Ages, and also that we don't know very much more even about transmission at an age that is much, much closer to our own. I have displayed here various articles of mine that may be of interest, that amplify various aspects of what I have spoken, even though Annie and Roberta have been very generous in allowing me an hour. I don't want to abuse their kindness. So this concludes my talk. Thank you very much indeed for your attention.
Thank you, Haig. Can you hear us?
Very much so.
Oh, perfect. Thank you very much. That was a wonderful presentation. We're going to just adjust very briefly for our discussion to make sure the sound's right. Just 1 minute.
By all means.
Perfect.
Can you hear us?
Can you hear us okay?
A gentleman somewhere. I can no longer hear anything now. I could until a moment ago.
Oh, there we
Ani,
go.
you seem to have muted yourself.
That's right. Can you hear us now?
I can indeed.
Perfect. Okay. So thank you again. That was a wonderful presentation. I very much enjoyed the melody and the beautiful, your voice is just very captivating. Thank you, Haig. If I may open for discussion, but I would like to start with Professor Abraham Terian and Professor Alexander, if I may just give the floor to you guys as respondents to Haig, and then we'll go from there. Is that okay? Fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you, Haig, for a very, very lucid presentation, as usual.
You're very kind.
You know that I'm not a musician, but giving this presentation, as well as others previously, I have a couple of questions. One is whether we think of the Armaš tradition or the Cairo or whatever was done in Jerusalem, even the entire preserved traditions among the Mechitarists. Wouldn't you say all these are of Constantinopolitan derivation of the last 2-3 centuries?
I must be careful what I say because I may be punished if I set foot in Armenia, if I agree too vigorously with you. If you want a short answer, it has to be yes. However, I would say that the Venetian tradition is noticeably and significantly different from the other Constantinopolitan-based traditions, consistently with two facts, consistently with the fact that the people who founded the Mechitarist congregation in Constantinople initially, let us not forget, and then went to Venice, and then the offshoot from Venice that went to Trieste and then Vienna. So they got separated from the main tree, and that branch had a semi-independent development. I say semi-independent because for a very long time, many of the monks were from Constantinople, so there must have been a tension between what was preserved on the island from somewhat earlier times and the tendencies to bring new things. We know that new things were introduced because officially it was admitted and acknowledged that some melodies of Babaham Partsum Limōnčean were adopted, and we know other melodies as well. And these melodies probably were composed in Constantinople, but did not survive in Constantinople. Likewise, if we examine under a microscope certain differences between what is sung today, what was recorded 50 years ago in sound recordings, or even earlier, and what was notated in the first half of the 20th century, and what was notated in the 1860s, there are differences as well, which suggests that, on the other hand, what was on the island did not stay the same. It developed in its own direction, which in some ways may have brought it closer to Constantinople. In others, it may have caused it to branch off. But yes, if we consider Vienna, Venice, Armaš, Bzomar, and Jerusalem, as far concerning whatever we've got from Jerusalem, which is probably not what used to exist in Jerusalem earlier on, unfortunately. That seems to have been lost. So yes, these things are branches of the same tree. It's just that some of the branches are closer together, and some of the branches are a little bit more independent, but they're connected to the same tree trunk. Now, when it comes to New Julfa and Calcutta, there we find interesting differences. Some of them seem, from a Constantinopolitan point of view, really rather outlandish, shockingly different, And yet, even then, there are some common points, and the similarities may be greater than is given credit for, because the New Julfa transcriptions are in Western notation, and Western notation only allowed an approximation of sorts. And then these transcriptions were doctored a little bit because they were given to an Anglican organist to harmonize, which he did in a simple-minded way and without an awareness of Armenian modality, although he did his best. Bianchini also had similar problems, but then Bianchini was a very great musician. But I mean, you can imagine someone like Yekmalian or Gomidas treated melodies differently than would someone like Bianchini, who was not accustomed with those modalities. But yes, they're connected, and this was demonstrated very, very poignantly when I was dividing the program for the Sistine Chapel. And initially I thought, we have to represent all these traditions. Let's sing one hymn in its entirety from a Constantinopolitan transcription, one the way Nersēs wrote it, another one, Dayan in Venice, and so on. And then I thought, no, let's have a hymn and sing one stanza from Zamar, one from a Bianchini transcription, one from a Dayan transcription, one from Antillas, one from Vahar Shabbat, and so on. And the differences made it interesting, but they were not so different as not to be compatible. And so they supported each other, and it was very, very clear, one could feel it on one's skin, as it were, that they are really all branches attached to the same tree. Now, sadly, the other side of the coin is goodness knows how much else may have existed. Some of it may have been very, very different, but it just didn't survive, it didn't reach us. Not because Constantinopolitans were nasty and dominant and they stifled everything else purposely, but remember, anything that was not notated was far less likely to reach us. Most of what we have has been preserved not through oral tradition these days, but because we can find transcriptions. Using remnants of the oral tradition, including historical recordings, we can have an inkling as to how we ought to realize these transcriptions. Even Dayan's Venetian transcriptions, also Bianchini's, and Bianchini says you have to use a special type of freedom, rhythmic freedom, when you read these transcriptions. But if you try to sing everything precisely as notated, you just kill it. The result is calculated, wooden. It is just the opposite of what it is meant to be. It's meant to sound almost as if it is being improvised, invented at that moment, coming straight from the heart. But without remnants of the oral tradition and some historical recordings, we wouldn't have a clue as to how to exercise that sort of freedom in interpreting the musical notation. And yet, most of what we have is thanks to the fact that it was notated, and sadly, much of what used to be sung, even as recently as the 19th century, was not notated, and so we just don't know what it sounded like, and we lost a lot of melodies. However, we can console ourselves knowing that even what little we have isn't little at all. It is a magnificent and very rich corpus, and most of it is kept in certain places where one is not able to access it. I was happy, though, to note a very, very positive recent exception for which I'm very grateful. But that means that we can hope that in time more things may emerge. And every time I was delivering a lecture on the subject of musical problems associated with St. Nersēs the Gracious, I haven't lectured about the odes particularly, but generally speaking, every time I gave a lecture, or every time I gave a lecture on Louis Zavart, which I've been talking about recently, each time I lecture, there's something new that has reached me, because someone who heard the previous lecture pointed out to me that they've got a manuscript, or there is an early publication or something or other, and then I've been able to enrich what I'm doing. So there's much else that we don't know about, and what we do know about and we haven't studied yet. And most importantly, in my view, we need to keep these things alive by dint of singing them in churches during services. And I hope that the Nersess Seminary continues to teach future clergy all the offices, inculcate in them a love for those services, and an aversion towards their unauthorized and barbarous excision or omission, so that those hymns and odes have their proper context in which they were intended to sound and in which they have the strongest effect on one's soul.
Yeah.
This concludes my
I
answer.
have critical questions, but of course I want to defer to Dr. Alexander here. And if time allows, then I'll come back to hypothetical questions. But for the sake of our precious time, I want to defer to Dr. Alexander for his questions or remarks.
Right. Thank you, Haig. It was a wonderful way that you mapped out, especially the early modern world and the variety, and also what you say about the various oral traditions overlapping. So I have a combination of observations and a few questions. So one of the things that I just noted right off the bat, though, as you were comparing the medieval to the early modern, was just the difference in the overall melodic profiles. I mean, not just that there's different melodies, but and you said there were 70 in this collection of the 13th century manuscript, 70 notated odes.
Yes, pneumatically notated, for which we don't have a clue about the music, sadly, other than what we can glean from the neumes. Yeah.
Are they all in the same sort of style, the short longs, and more or less the same melodic idiom? Does it, according to what you can tell from the neumations?
I'm not sure. I wouldn't dare to say so. Because I haven't studied all 70 of the notations for the Shnorali odes in the manuscript. What I can tell you, in the case of the odes associated with St. Gregory of Narek, is that they are not all in the same style, but there is a propensity to have particular syllables with very rich and long chains of neumes. But there are also other examples, Siavem, Keretzik, Di, Rappa, long, short, long, short, long. So I imagine that if we find this kind of variety within the smaller corpus of the Naregazzi odes, in all likelihood, we will find that and more in the much more extensive corpus of the Shnorali odes. But I have not examined all 70. I have not examined more than just a few.
Then the scope of the collection, that if one was looking for parallels, it looks more to me something like a sticherarion, a kind of normal sticherarion, in which case you if you're looking at the Byzantine tradition, where you have certain passages maybe melismatic or particular hymns have some more, but overall the prevailing idiom is more syllabic, and it seems more syllabic than the melodic examples that you showed us from the early modern period, which I found itself very, very interesting. So bearing that in mind, that just at least the excerpts you showed us of the same text, those three odes, is it possible that there might also be operating at some level some kind of process of exegesis as well, because there is this tendency in as you know, in Ottoman classical music as well as in the Byzantine church music, for older melodies to reach the 19th century in a fairly melismatic form?
That's a very interesting question. It is one about which I have thought quite a lot. I would say that as far as our extant melodies are concerned, I strongly suspect that they are the result of radical recomposition from much more recent times than the neumations, rather than exegesis. However, in the case of the hymnal, which is a different genre, I find it much more plausible that processes of exegesis may have bridged the gap between what we have now and what may indeed have corresponded to the neumes. And then that leads us to some intriguing questions, but confining myself for the moment to the hymnal, not to the odes, so it's a slightly different thing. There is a tendency for things, except for the most exceedingly melismatic examples, which no longer respect what I'm going to say, but for everything other than that, the exegeses seem to preserve the same metrical proportions as the syllabic versions. Even though they're much, much, much longer, they try to preserve those same proportions. This does tend to suggest that there was a process of exegesis and calophonia and so on and so forth for those things. As far as the odes are concerned, they seem to be completely different to the neumes. You may find a very, very, very long melisma sung somewhere where in the medieval notation there is just a simple push sign, which has only one beat associated with it. So the melismas are often on different syllables than the ones where you find chains of neumes in the medieval manuscripts, which seems to suggest that it's not likely that these melodies are based on those. Another thing that would reinforce my impression, and it is only an impression, I can't answer unequivocally, sorry. I can't answer unequivocally. It's to do with the fact that the later manuscripts of odes and the earliest publications of odes, neumated publications, Constantinople typically, end of 17th century, beginning of 18th century, they have very much simplified neumations. Hardly anyone was making use of the neumes in singing those odes. And indeed, many publications did not even bother to reproduce odes for the neumes for the odes, because there were brand new melodies and several of them. And there are also, as you know, because during one of our very first meetings, when we had tea together after evensong after Vespers in Oxford, I showed you in Kabasakalian's 1794 compilation, where there's a mysterious, or there are several different mysterious hybrid notations that bring together Armenian neumes and Byzantine neumes. For some odes for which we have musical versions, it would seem, again, from the distribution of the musical signs over syllables of text, that these melodies that Kabasakalian was trying to capture in his various invented systems also differ from the melodies that we've got. So I suspect there to have been several layers of recomposition in the case of the odes. It seems to me that the church was much more permissive for odes, because odes are not strictly liturgical items, they're not strictly canonical items, there is more latitude, and I think it was much more acceptable for church musicians in Constantinople in the 18th century to compose their own music for the words of a particular ode. Oh, by the way, new words could also be composed. That also did happen, we know that. But this is taking us further away from St. Nersess. The only thing I would say to caution you about your suggestion is it's extremely difficult for us, unlike the Byzantine case, the Middle Byzantine case, it's extremely difficult for us to judge the length of melismata that may have been sung when we've got a bird's nest of interconnected neumes on a single syllable of an ode, because we just don't know what neume means in the Armenian case. In the Byzantine case, we have the tremendous advantage that we know that a particular sign corresponds to a note at a certain interval compared to the note before it. the diastematic system means that whenever we see symbols, we know that there's going to be another note. So there's a direct proportionality between the density of the notation and the density of what is sung. In the Armenian case, when I see a vernachar, which is a sort of diagonal line going from southwest to northeast, followed by a long sort of mordant sign connected to it, I just don't know what was meant to happen during the 2 beats that it is meant to represent. Do those squiggles correspond to a lot of movement, numerous notes, or just a couple of notes? And in the hymnal, of course, this may have given scope for more exegetical approaches and developments, more melismatic versions. In the case of the odes, however, by glancing at these, you can tell that there is something that is longer, very possibly much longer, but how much longer, one just does not know. There's another thing. For complex combinations of neumes over a single syllable, we are not able to compute the overall duration. It doesn't seem likely that there is a simple additive rule. That also renders us quite unable to tell what the relative proportions would have been in the case of complex neumations, and to what extent that may have been preserved in later melodies, in the case of the hymnal. In the case of the odes, it seems very unlikely that there was correspondence. Even crude comparisons, just looking at where the melismata are situated in the text, shows disparities. So unlike the hymnal, there was no attempt to preserve some correspondence, it seems, in the case of the odes.
You and I can take up in future, continue our comparative work. I just one more sort of observation about one very specific case, the Papa Avediat that you had of the Bianchini version versus the later transcription, one being a kind of,
yes.
You said that perhaps Bianchini, if you're saying the E was a little flatter or the B was a little flatter, well, then you end up just with the difference between C major and makam rast, which isn't that big of, between nipav, nipavu, and nipavu, digavu, badi. But one thing that is happening actually in the Greek world in the late Ottoman period is that you do find some very bizarre cases. So everybody knows Tipermacho, the second prologue to the Akathistos, for the Annunciation hymn, Tipermacho, Tipermacho, Stratigotan. It's in that sort of Rastish mode, play go forth. But there is a version from Smyrna that was recorded by the protopsaltis there, Maneas, before the destruction of the city, that is in minor. And this is a universally known melody, and somehow in Smyrna at the cathedral, he managed to sing a minor mode version of it. So that sort of transformation that you see between the two versions of that hymn is something that also occurred in this case in 2 parts of the Greek Ottoman world.
A very interesting analogy. I want to pin you down one day because I want to write about it, if I may, quoting you. Very, very interesting. Very, very interesting. What we do know, of course, from the Limōnčean notation itself is Hijaz itself was... apparently I'm gesticulating too much because my computer is telling me add effects using hand gestures. I hope nothing dramatic will happen. I'll try and keep my hands still. In Kimtsa hymns, the earliest transcriptions in the Limōnčean notation, if you think of the augmented second, the tetrachord A, B flat, C sharp, D. So they didn't have an A sharp, which is what most of what the later Limōnčean transcriptions have for Kimtsa, for that B flat. You have the sign for a slightly lower B natural, which can then be made more or less into a B natural with a little tilde added for it. So when there is no tilde, it's not a B natural, it's a very slightly flattened be. And so the way nowadays we sing, particularly with organ, a hymn that is Kimtza, that is Hijaz, it's just the Western harmonic scale with the augmented second. But there's evidence of this sort if you look at the way in which the Limōnčean notation was used more archaically, because its use did change in various subtle ways. So that does suggest that the Armenian equivalent of Hijaz may have been milder, and that interval was less stark. It was something between major and minor. And it is such instances that may have come to have been interpreted either in one direction or in the other, when people were in the position of having to decide how to capture such a melody in Western staff notation. They did not have any of the symbols we now use to indicate a slight raising, a slight lowering, the bemoletto that Diane invented, or other things. They had to write either something that is major or a minor. And in Amy Apkar's Calcutta transcriptions, there are various items that sound very, very odd. A very odd sort of major key, but it doesn't seem to make tonal sense in its own terms, which, if you realize that probably the way it was sung, it had a slightly flattened second degree, then you find that a melody that is really very, very odd joins the fold and is not all that different from the Constantinopolitan melodies. One example is Antaram Zarig, Unfading Flower, the Prandi hymn for the Dormition of the Mother of God. And there are others. I've written about this and plan to write more about it as well. So any analogies or contradistinctions with the Greek tradition are of very, very great interest, because, as I always keep saying, we have very much to learn from the Greek tradition in order to understand our own tradition better, for two main reasons. One is that Greeks were more fortunate in having an unbroken monastic tradition, thanks to Mount Athos and other places that were not destroyed, whereas virtually the whole of the Armenian monastic tradition was destroyed, apart from San Lazzaro. And the second reason is that because, happily, in the case of the Byzantine tradition, we are more or less able to read the Middle Byzantine neumes, albeit with certain uncertainties on particular points, whereas we are not able to derive comparable information from the medieval Armenian neumes. And the third reason, if I may add a third reason, is that there were direct connections, as we have both had occasion to explore together very happily in the past, direct connections, especially in the melting pot of Constantinople, between Armenian and Constantinopolitan Greek church musicians and church musics. Something that has not, I think, been explored sufficiently so far, although you and I have both tried to contribute to that process.
Thank you. Thank you, Haig. Thank you, Alex.
Does Abraham have any further questions, if time permits? Because I don't want these questions to remain unspoken, or I don't want to deprive you of your dinner. In a sense, yes. I'm in the selfish position. It is now 11:30 at night, so all the places where I could buy a baguette from have closed. So it will be a dietary night for me, but that's no reason to deprive you from your dinner.
Haig, it's such a pleasure. It would be wonderful to go on at least for a bit more with questions, but I think our reservation will not allow us in. Hence, right, I would have to go with that limit. But thank you. I want to once again thank everyone in person who contributed and offered very insightful thoughts on both your presentation, but also on the previous panels. Thank you, all of you who have joined us from very, very late hours. So thank you for staying up on such a late time, Haig. I really appreciate that. Thank you to our colleagues from Armenia. Also, very much enjoyed seeing all of you on here for the duration of the panels and the talk. So I just want to make a very brief announcement. Tomorrow, we will start at 10 a.m. Once again, here, Zoom will resume at 10 for us in person, 9:30, please. And we will begin with Haig Utidjian and Seda Manukian's paper. And then after that, it will be Jesse presenting his paper in person here at the seminary. I hope that if there are any confusion or any questions to address sort of logistically, happy to do that. Otherwise, I just want to say congratulations to everyone for such a successful day one to this conference. So thank you. Just a round of applause. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Annie and Roberta, for a splendidly organized conference. It was a great pleasure to take part. Allow me to wish you bon appetit. I shall derive some vicarious enjoyment from the knowledge that you're having a splendid, well-deserved meal.
Thank you, Haig, and thank you, everyone. Have a great evening. Rest well and see you tomorrow.